There we go. We're live.
And we're live. It's always the waiting for the people to jump in as fast as possible. We'll just wait just a second here. As I know people have been refreshing to get in. We'll just wait a minute here so we don't have anybody miss anything on the front end. Okay. All right. So we're gonna get started here. Dan, let's have that screen up and ready to roll.
It should be up, Mike.
Okay. Got it. Okay, so still no see. Okay, so everybody sees the slides. We are live. We are good to go. We are at our final session of the Friends of the Boundary Waters annual gathering. Tonight's session, it's all about the wilderness. We worry about three things. We'll get into this. Before that, I'm Mike Linneman. I'm Development and Membership Director here for the Friends of the Boundary Waters. If you don't know who the Friends are, we're a nonprofit, been around since 1976, and our mission does three things. We protect, we preserve, and we restore the wilderness character of the Boundary Waters and its surrounding ecosystem from the Quetico to Lake Superior. You know, just as a moose would walk over the border, we also worry on the entire ecosystem for protection. Our vision for this future of this national treasure really lies at the intersection of people, communities, and wilderness. And that's how we worry about all of our programs during our annual gathering. Tonight, again, wilderness, the last of the thing. Tonight's evening of wilderness is sponsored, and our sponsors are Paul Fate, Amy Rokabar, wonderful folks. I have two speakers and one volunteer for you to enjoy tonight, and I want to go over some basic info for you during this Zoom call. So if you have questions, please ask them in the Q&A, and to figure out where that is, you got to drop your mouse to the bottom of your screen, and it says like participants, Q&A, chat. The Q&A, drop questions in there at any time. We're going to cover those at the end, and you might have a couple good ones. The chat function, really you can choose the one of us if you want to have something a little quick clarified or some sort of follow-up there. Feel free to sound off in the chat anytime during the presentation. With me is Dan Pauly and Rob Christ, but before we get to those two, we have a volunteer, a very special volunteer in here today, and that is Kesley Ebbs. Kesley, can you hear us?
Hey.
Hello, Kesley.
Can you hear me?
We can. So, Kesley, we'd love to know, who are you? Give us some info on your experience that you had as a volunteer.
All right. Well, I was with the Conservation Corps in Minnesota and Iowa, and then I was just searching on for volunteer positions, and I found an opening with the Forest Service in Ely, this place I'd never heard before, way up north. And I was like, well, what I got to lose? I came up, and everybody was super excited to greet me, really flexible with schedules. And I wasn't really prepared for the winter up here. So when I got in, I got to talk with Jamie Lowe, and he's the coordinator for our volunteers up in the Kawishway Ranger District. And he got me set up with winter gear, and I definitely don't regret. I'm still in Ely. I'm planning on staying for a while, and definitely on my to-do list is get a canoe and get back out there.
Wonderful to hear. Wonderful to hear. Kesley, you worked volunteering during the winter, which is a bit unique. Can you mention one of the projects you worked on?
Oh, one of the most exciting projects is I got to go out with a dog sled team, and we actually did some trail clearing. So we camped overnight and got to ride the dog sled for the first time. Just clearing the trails, making things look clean. I learned a lot about wilderness rules, what you could bring into the boundary waters. proper leave no trace. And the rest of the time we did a lot of different things. I actually got to do some links tracking, and that was fun. Included snowmobiling to check permit boxes and just getting out there and talking to people about ice fishing and seeing where everybody was and making sure they have their permit. And it was a fun time.
We're happy to have you in here, Kesley. And for folks that are in the area, he'll be around a little bit more for this following winter. We'll get some pancakes soon, Kesley. You and I, blueberry, of course.
Sounds good.
Well, with that, Kesley, we'll let you get back to it. I know you're working on some of the firefighting activities up there in the so we'll let you get back to that for the rest of the night. And thanks for stopping by here tonight, Kesley.
No problem.
All right, so next up we have Dan Pauly, who is an author, former board member of ours, attorney, Renaissance man, and more. And Dan is going to be talking about winter camping in the Boundary Waters. After him will be Rob Chris that talks about ice fishing. You can see the rest of our community here that we had that really supported these events, why this was free to attend. We had sponsors that all chipped in to really make that accessible. And we hope you enjoyed all the content tonight. So without further ado, Dan, you have the floor. Welcome.
Good. Thank you, Mike. So good to be here tonight. Thanks for joining us. Friends, a great organization, and always good to have people participating and learning about the Boundary Waters. I'm going to be talking obviously about camping, winter camping specifically in the Boundary Waters. And I've been doing it for years. I've done it, in all kinds of ways. I'm going to show some of the gear I use. And most of my camping is probably in the warmer weather, canoeing, but I'll tell you, going up in the winter rather, is spectacular, and some of my best memories and best trips have been in the winter. And I really encourage people to think about the opportunity that Boundary Waters presents in terms of the winter. And one thing I was going to say, even just this week, the Boundary Waters has been recognized as a dark sky sanctuary. I'm not sure if that's the proper term, but one of 13 in the world. And that's one of the things I don't have slides on, but it's an incredible place to possibly see the Northern Lights, or the stars in the winter with those cold, clear nights can be magnificent. So, that's just one reason to get up there in terms of the winter. But what I'm going to talk about today is first go over some of the things that really do make the Boundary Waters incredible winter, some of the things that are different than being up in the summer. And then I'm going to spend a fair amount of time talking about two things that are going to be different than the summer and different than probably most other winter activities, like say your typical cross-country skiing or ice fishing or something like that. So I'm gonna spend some time talking about transportation, since you're not going up by canoe, and then also the different shelter options. I got everything from super, super ultralight to heavier, heated, unheated, and we'll talk about all those things. That shelter in particular is the big critical decision, and you wanna match that to your expectations, what you're gonna be doing on the trip and to have a great trip. And then just a little bit of gear review in terms of showing. I'll do a little show and tell on some of the tents that I have. And then we'll have a chance at the end after Rob to answer any questions folks have. So first off, in terms of why I love going up the Boundary Waters in the winter, first off, magnificent, beautiful. The landscape is obviously going to be much different than the summer. These two shots were from last year when I was up with actually Rob and a couple other folks. And we were off the Gunflint Trail near Tuscarora Lodge. You go down through Round Lake. There's a lake called Blue Snow Lake. And you can't really get to it normally. There's no regular portages to it. But one of the great things in the winter is you can go in areas you can't get to otherwise. All right. And so you see some of these beautiful areas. This is a tamarack swamp that we snowshoed through. This is actually on our way out. But so you're going to see things that you're just not going to see. You're not going to see, the beautiful, snow and trees, but the leaves are down. So you're going to see deeper into, see like some of the rock formations and stuff like that. So my next slide shows an example on the left. This is off the Angleworm Trail, which is off of Angleworm Lake, which you get to by going west out of Ely on the Echo Trail. And then it's, about a 6 or 7 mile snowshoe to where we are here. And this is a rock face that has in the background some icicles forming. And again, that's, you know, it would be hard to even get to this in the winter, or excuse me, in the summer because of things like, you know, the downed trees and the leaves and stuff like that. But that's the kind of thing you'll see. And then also you're going to be able to cover some areas that you wouldn't be able to easily cover or not in the same way. So on the right-hand side here, I have us, this is off of Seagull Lake, which is at the end of the Gunflint Trail. And I've been up there many times in the winter. And this is snowshoeing around part of 3 Mile Island, I think it is actually. And then that's obviously a long island, 3 miles long, basically, that you would never be able to cross that thing over the top of it in the summer without really a lot of work. But we snowshoed over the top of it. And so you're going to places that, you know, you're just not otherwise going to really be able to see. You know, first off, beautiful, seeing stuff that you wouldn't otherwise see is why I love to go up in the winter. Another thing, I have found that some of my more interesting sort of animal observations and things like that have definitely actually been in the winter. So on the left here, I have a snowshoe hare. You're not going to see many of these. You're going to see their tracks, but you know they're super well camouflaged. This one we got a picture of. So you know you might see some animals like this, and I've seen you know, most of the animals that are going to be active in the winter, I've seen up there in the winter. I've seen, you know, moose. I've seen wolves. You know, the bears are obviously dormant. I haven't seen lynx. I'd love to see lynx. I've seen a few other animals, so that's pretty cool. And even if you don't see the actual animal like we have here on the left, you're definitely going to see tracks. And on the right-hand side, that's some tracks that actually is, again, these are near the angleworm trail, again, off of the Echo Trail. And so if you take a look at that, I'm going to tell you, those tracks are about 8 inches wide. Just take a look at them for a second and think what you think might have made those. All right, that is the track of an otter, actually. So a river otter, the otters that freshwater otters that live up in the boundary waters, they travel across the snow in the winter, kind of like a toboggan, where they sort of just use their back legs to push themselves along. And we followed this trail for a long ways. You'll often find this kind of trail skirting the edge of the lake as the otter is maybe looking for like openings, places to feed and hunt. It's interesting, I was up, I don't have a picture of it here, but I was up like 3 years ago on Duncan Lake, which is again off of the Gunflint Trail, about halfway up the Gunflint Trail. And me and a couple of folks were snowshoeing into where we were going. And we saw a trail like this. And I said, well, hey, I wonder what that, I said, we're all like crossing, and I said, I wonder what that is. And I said, well, I think that's an otter track. And the other two guys were like, well, no, because if you see here at oops, let me go back there. If you see there, it has a little depressions that look a little bit like a deer track maybe. And so someone's like, well, I think it's deer. Somebody else said from the hooves, and somebody said, well, I think it's a moose. I said, no, this is definitely an otter. And they kind of dismissed it because like who would see an otter in the middle of winter? And then we went around a corner and the otter was sitting on the snow. He's like next to like a log 100 feet away. And so that was kind of funny. So you're going to see trails and tracks like this. You know, that makes it kind of interesting. And there's a bunch of books and websites and stuff you can see to learn about the different types of tracks. But, you know, that's a cool thing to sort of track and figure what's up there. My next slide is showing some pictures of other animals we saw. And this is actually quite a few years ago. This is about 15 years ago. We were up on Seagull Lake, again on 3 Mile Island. If you've been up there, that island goes north-south, and there's a little narrows. And this is kind of near the narrows on the east side of that lake. And we were in the tent, and we heard something outside, and it was super cold, like 25 below. It was getting down to about 40 below that night. And we heard something outside, and we jump out, and there's a wolf, which you see here in the bottom left. This is just a video capture, so it doesn't look too sharp. So there's 2 wolves actually, and a deer, and the wolves had actually caught up to the deer. And they brought that deer down about 200 feet from us. We saw that, and they actually moved away, and they came back that night to eat it, which that was fascinating. But the really fascinating thing to see was the next day we went out, there was fresh snow. If you look on the upper left here, there's some tracks. This is right on that bay, the long, narrow bay on the east side of Seagull Lake. And there were tracks all over that lake. And the snow had snowed like maybe 3 or 4 hours before the deer had been caught by the wolves. And so we were able to watch exactly where the wolves had chased the deer. And what was very fascinating is there's only 2 wolves, and the wolves took turns pursuing the deer. The deer was trying to get up into the woods where I think it maybe would have been safer. And one wolf would chase after it into the woods, shoo it back down onto the lake, and then the other wolf would take off. And they'd been back and forth a number of times. They're such a, I mean, they're such an amazingly intelligent predator. And then I think the deer essentially wore out, and that's when they were able to catch it. Because it didn't really put up much of a fight at the end. So that was an amazing thing to see, and you're only going to see that in the winter. The other thing I've seen in this track is actually of that on the right is we were on Mudrow Lake on a different trip, and we went on a 4 or 5 hour snowshoe. We went out and back, and when we went out, we crossed over some wolf tracks, and then when we came back, the wolves had crossed again back over our tracks. So, you know, it's the sort of thing that, you know, those wolves maybe saw us. Certainly they knew we were there because of the smells, but we were sharing the wilderness and had literally crossed paths, although we didn't see those wolves. And actually the only wolves I have seen were that other trip in the winter. But they're out there, and I've frequently followed wolf tracks. I like to actually sometimes follow like moose tracks, wolf tracks to see where it's all going. So the animal life, whether it's tracks or seeing them, is something that I think is different and frankly, in many ways, better than going up in the summer. So another reason that's neat to go up in the winter is you'll see stuff that's just really not visible. Again, and what I have here is this is actually off of Angleworm, where the Forest Service used to put a few of these up. And this has got to be like 30 or 40, maybe more years old. This is a post marking a campsite. And I've been through that way many times in the summer. I just don't see this thing. But the winter trips, I've seen it. And also, like up on that trail, there used to be a Forest Service fire tower. And you can go, well, actually on this trip, I was up there, we were snowshoeing, and we looked up, and a big old white pine was one of those like glass resistors, because they would have had like some sort of cable going out, like a telephone type line going to that fire tower. And that's a long time ago, but this old white pine was still hanging up there. It was kind of amazing. And you just see stuff differently in the winter. So I love going up in the winter, and I highly recommend it. Another reason besides those things is you might love the challenge, right? And so what I have here is a picture where I was up with Rob, who's going to speak later. And again, this is actually on Seagull. It's one of my go-to lakes, although I've been to a lot of them up there. And you'll see here, that's at 40 below. Yep, the 30 is above the 40. And that's the point where Celsius and Fahrenheit are the same temperature. So, you know, that's kind of a point of pride for me, having been up that cold. I've been up maybe 2 or 3 times it was about that cold, but we got it on a thermometer this time, so that was cool. And you can see on the left, that's just from being out a little time, this perspiration froze up on my hat and my face. Although, and I'll talk about tents, like we slept like babies the night before. We were very comfortable, and we'll talk about that. And then, you know, I don't have a slide on this, but another reason that it's great to go up in the winter is there's no mosquitoes. So, you know, those are the reasons I love going up in the winter. I've been up dozens of times. It's phenomenal. What are the things that are going to make for a good trip? And, you know, you're going to get a lot of advice on clothing, layers, stuff like that. So I don't want to go with that today. I wanted to tell people things that they might not otherwise know about winter camping in terms of the shelter. And so we're going to talk about ski versus snowshoe and sled options, and then shelters in a second. So in terms of transportation, I'm a snowshoe guy, and so these are snowshoes from one of our trips, but you can also cross-country ski. And so if you look on the right here, this is I think it's on Partridge Lake, but this is a couple of years ago up in the Boundary Waters, where that gentleman has skis on that he had skins he could put on. So it's sort of a backcountry ski. Those worked pretty good, other than we got into rough terrain. We were going over to the Staircase Portage, and that didn't work so good. But you know, on the lake, that can work pretty good. I prefer a snowshoe, because like you can like navigate much more. You can turn much sharper. But that's your 2 great options, right? You're either a snowshoe or you're going to ski, especially if they have a backcountry type ski. on the left, actually, now sometimes there's not that much snow and you can just walk in, and that's what that picture is. And that's going over the really long portage, like a 500 rod portage up over to Paulson Lake, which is a great lake trout lake. Again, it's actually off of Seagull at the end of the Gunflint Trail, and that, you know, is a nice destination. But the other thing I have this slide up for is in terms of how you carry your gear. And on the left is actually what I use. It's the least expensive way. Those are sleds that are basically, you know, $25, $30 sleds, maybe a little bit more, at a place like Fleet Farm. And they have little holes in them so you can run some ropes through there. And that's what I use. And those things, and then we just use big duffel bags and tie the gear down. I found that is great. One reason I like to do that too is I go up with, you know, usually like 4 or 5 people, maybe 6, who don't have their own like gear. And this is a way to like me get 5 sleds, give them to people to borrow, and it works out great. Notably, most of the rules really, you know, other than like needing to get a permit reserved in advance, most of the rules are still going to apply in the winter that are in the summer, right? So you still need to get a permit, and you just issue that yourself at the entry point. And then you still have to do, for example, follow the 9-person rule. So you can't be more than 9 people. The other, so that's one way, that's your least expensive way of hauling your gear. On the right in this picture is a pulk, P-U-L-K, which you can buy, or actually you can rent those, like Paragus rents those up in Ely. And that's, you know, customized for sort of backcountry. The big thing is it's going to have probably a smoother base. It's going to be, you know, a little easier to pull. And then those poles rather, are going to help you when you're going downhill. The sled's not going to bang into your feet. You know, that's a nice way of doing it. Actually, I've had my other way I've done it for many years. And what I do is I have a rope and then a strap that I'll just put it over my shoulder. And I actually got that technique from the guy who makes the tents, the Snow Trucker tents, Dwayne Leidig. So I'll show you that in a second. There's one more way that I'm not showing, and that is you can get these foldable, like rollable toboggans, which are just a piece of really hard plastic that's long that you can strap your gear onto. And so you Google that, just a few places you can buy those. And those are actually very nice too. Those things are great, but it's not what I have, again, because I'm trying to keep the cost down so I can bring, you know, my friends in and not have too much of that gear. But that's a great way to go. The thing I wouldn't usually use, and some people you'll see use it, is like a wide winter camping, wide ice fishing type sled, because those things are really kind of more geared for pulling behind a snowmobile. Not so good on a portage, or, you know, you're just going to like burn a lot more energy pulling a wider sled like that. So that's the sort of how you get around thing. But the next thing that I'm going to spend the most time on tonight is going over the different shelter options. So in this screen in the background, you have just like sort of your classic North Face REI type tent. I've done that a few times, numerous times actually. It can be great, and it can be fine even when it's very cold. Some people, they love doing this, right? Get a warm sleeping bag, you're good, okay? That is nice. The disadvantage of that is that you know, there's no way to get dried off, and you really don't have a second source of heat, okay? But we'll talk about, and that's what I want to spend more time on in a second. Now, if you really want to go ultralight, there's nothing like a Quincy, okay? And so I've done these numerous times. All you need is a shovel, and you make a big pile of snow. It has to be your pretty good snow, but you know, Boundary Waters, even with climate change, it's still got a lot of snow. And you make a big pile of snow, you put some sticks in so you know, like how, you know, a foot thick, you know, point, you let it sit for 3 or 4 hours, carve it out. The picture on the left is my nephew. I was with my nephew and my college-age son. And so he's on the left after we carved it out. And then on the right it's a little backlit. But you can see, I think it's him or my son on top. These things are very tough, very strong once they harden up. And, you know, you can sleep in it. So you know, you look at that doesn't look that comfortable because you've got the snow there. But the snow blazes over, and they get surprisingly warm. If it's properly made, it will get, you know, basically up to freezing. It doesn't usually get much above freezing because you got the snow there, but it could be very comfortable. one thing that's interesting about a Quincy is uh, incredibly silent inside. You won't hear anything outside because that insulated snow is such a great insulator. So, you know, if you want to go ultra light, there's nothing like a Quincy. Also, obviously, very inexpensive to make. The thing is, you need to get started like early in the day if that's what you're going to do, because you got to get to camp, make your pile of snow, let it sit for a few hours, and then carve it out. But it can be an excellent way of going. I've done it numerous times and have been very comfortable in there. So let's say you want to go a little warmer. Okay, so I'm going to show you two tent designs that I have, and the first one here is one made by Seek Outside. And I've had this tent for a few years, and this is your center pole design. And I'll go to that next picture showing you the inside of it. But these tents have a center pole. You can see on the left, or like the left of the chimney here, sort of that's a pole. And center pole, and then you just stake out the outside, sometimes what we call dead men, like little sticks sort of stuck in the snow. But what's nice about this design, so it's obviously heated inside with this little titanium wood stove. At the end of today's presentation, I'm just going to show you that quickly because I have it here. And so you can get this relatively warm, and that stove's very lightweight. But probably the disadvantage of this design is that it's this nylon. And again, the whole thing's very light. It's about a 10-pound tent, but it doesn't breathe. And so you'll get some condensation on the inside of it that turns to like frost and flakes off. It's kind of a disadvantage, but you can still get it warm, and they have some ways to minimize that with a liner. But this is a nice design, pretty lightweight. You're going to be able to get warmed up inside, dry off your gear. Notably, you can rent this, I think, from a couple of places. I think Sawtooth Outfitters rents one of these, not with that stove, but a different stove, up on Highway 61. So, you know, this is a great option, right? It's super light. You could pull this thing down in like 10 minutes and go to another location. So this is nice. The other thing about this sort of tent, this one in particular, actually, this company Seek Outside, is you can get like different kinds of liners. So like you can have like a little bug liner in there, like a little like cocoon, like a place to keep the mosquitoes out if you want to use it in the summer. And actually, you can put it on a screen door. You can use it all summer long if you wanted. So it's a nice ultra light technique that is it's a great way to go. I've had, you know, if I want to move every day, this is a really nice way to go. So the sort of most luxurious way, and the way that I probably have done the most, is with a canvas tent. And so this tent, the one I'm showing here, is a Snow Trekker. It used to be Empire Canvas. A number of years ago, they changed the name. And so Snow Trekker tents are made by a gentleman and his family in Siren, Wisconsin. And they were sort of one of the real pioneers in getting that type of tent out there in common use. And there's some other folks like Garrett Conover and his wife that have really done a lot. But in the Midwest here, Dwayne Leidick has really advanced the skills, I think, and makes these great tents. And I've had two of his tents. I actually still have them both. But some things that are notable about them, you can't see in this picture, but they have sort of a sawhorse A-frame. And so you just put that frame up and then throw the tent over the top. You guy it out. You put your stove in there. You put maybe a liner on the floor. And you've got a cabin in the woods. It's really it's spectacular. If we go to my next picture, you can see here we are camping, and this is almost a night type shot. And this is actually my older tent that has a teepee style door on it. But I'll tell you the things that's nice about this type of tent, similar to the Seek Outside tent, but maybe slightly better, is number one, you've got obviously a source of heat, so that's great. But the thing that the heat allows you to do is you can dry off all your clothes. This is almost like the number one benefit, right? Your boots, anything, you hang them by the stove, and it's such a dry heat in the winter, all that stuff dries out. And like maybe you even leave it up for a couple hours as you go to bed. The next morning, your fleece, your boot liners, your gloves, all the stuff that got sweaty and cold or had snow on it, it's bone dry. You put it on, you're super comfortable. So that allows you to be up there for day after day. And when I've done this camping where I didn't have that option, where I didn't have a source of heat, you know, I'd go up, and your boot liners get soft, they get wet, and the next day they're frozen solid and very hard to put on. You can put them in your sleeping bag or under your sleeping bag, but still it's not the same as having that stuff really dry out. And the other reason I love a hot tent like this is it extends the day, right? We're in Minnesota, we're at a northern latitude. What happens, you know, sun might be setting 5 o'clock or 4 o'clock, even in the afternoon. And if you don't have a source of heat, you kind of like eat your cold food like around a fire and then you go to bed. But with this, you hang a couple small LED lights in there. You can sit around for hours hanging out, playing games, whatever it might be, play some cards, drink some scotch if that's your thing. And so that is what I really, you know, it makes it like almost having your own cabin on a private lake in the Boundary Waters. I mean, it's really, I can't say strongly enough how sweet that is. And it's not that expensive. So that's where I really love that kind of tent. And so this tent is actually, again, this is my earlier version that's a little heavier. Dwayne and Empire, excuse me, Stow Tracker, now they're making out of a thinner cotton, an Egyptian cotton that makes for a quite small tent, relatively speaking. I've got it here. I'm going to show you that. I'll lift it up at the end here. Another thing, you can make just about anything, all right? You're not worried about your food spoiling, you're worried about it freezing, but you can prevent that if it needs to be. And so you know, here's some blueberry pancakes. You can bring in some chairs here. This is my son from a few years ago. We were up there and had a great time. You cook anything because you cook right on that wood stove. Here we are sleeping. Here he is sleeping. I showed this picture for a few reasons. First of all, super comfortable. You know, he doesn't have a big hat on, any of that stuff. That's a very warm sleeping bag because he's a little kid. I brought a nice warm one. But a couple things, you still need to have a very good mat. If you've got sort of a thin mat, then I bring 2 air mattresses or whatever you've got. This is a down mat by Exped, EXPED. They make some down and some other ones. These are great mats. They're relatively on the higher price side, but those are excellent because you're going to lose, if you lose heat, you're going to really lose it to the ground. Another thing that's in this picture that I would point out is you see at the bottom left, those are little green booties you can buy a lot of places. That's kind of nice to have too, because what we normally do is we'll leave our boots at the door and then go in, and so we don't carry snow, and we'll change it to say a tennis shoe or something like that. So very comfortable. You can keep the stove going all night if you want, or you can have it go off and then just, you know, fire it up in the morning. This is, I think, my last shot of maybe of one more of, you know, cutting wood. I mean, one thing you're going to do is you're going to cut a lot of wood in the middle of the winter if you're trying to keep that tent warm. This is an interesting, or this is one way, and I'm not going to show you all the different types of saws, but this is a example of a little bow saw that I got. But there's a number of good saws you can use, but you're going to cut a lot of wood. Fortunately, it's not so hard to find like in the summer because you can go right back into the woods. I do want to talk about, and actually we're going to have Rob Chris talk about hammock here, because Rob has been a hammock camper for many years, and he's been doing it in the winter on some of our trips. So Rob's just going to spend a couple minutes telling us about hammocking, whether you have a hot tent along or not.
Yeah, certainly it kind of looks and kind of sounds like an unorthodox type of shelter in the winter in Minnesota, but I have become a devout tree hanger, air sleeper, however you want to call it, in the summer, and so I started doing it in the winter. The first and foremost, like everyone would think about, is the insulation, right? You need to have what you call an underquilt, which is basically a down quilt that seats right up next underneath the hammock and provides that bottom insulation for any drafts that come through. And then you need a top quilt or a very nice sleeping bag on top of that. You certainly sleep warm. I do usually wear a hat. It's not going to be as warm as a hot tent. But then some of the other things that you can really do, you can notice in this picture here that there's actually some door panels on this tarp that can stop any crosswinds coming through there. And then pile up some of the snow right at the bottom there. I hadn't done that completely here yet. You can see where I started on some of the ends. But when going through there is going to be one of the biggest issues you need to overcome. But quite frankly, it's a very comfortable sleep, even if you don't have a hot tent. But as Dan alluded to, if somebody did bring a hot tent along, take advantage of that heat. Hang out in that hot tent for a while at night, warm yourself up, and then walk over to your hammock while you're still all that body heat and all that warmth from that hot tent. Jump into the hammock and retain all that heat and that warm down. It definitely is a viable option for winter camping.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Another thing I don't have a slide on, but just to be complete, some people like to use a bivy sack. And so you can just use, which is basically a shell that you sleep in, like almost like a very small tent. And that can work great too. And that can either be, in lieu of a hammock, and maybe you're using that even though you have a hot tent, as a way just you sleeping, just warming up in the hot tent. But people like to do that as well. I would also mention Seek Outside, who we were just talking about with that teepee tent or that pyramid tent. That's a nice tent, but another local company, Cook Custom Canvas, makes something a little bit different design, but also very lightweight that you could try as well. So there's been a lot of innovation actually in winter camping in the last 10 years. And there's some kind of interesting products out there that you can give a go at. A few things here in terms of like getting started. So it's obviously, not the same gear that you're taking on a summer trip, or even if you're just going cross country skiing someplace. So, if you're going to do the hot tent thing, you can rent those. And again, I said earlier, like Paragus and Ely rents them. Sawtooth Outfitters rents them up on the Highway 61. And so, you can rent those things, and it's about the same cost, $50 a day, as a Kevlar canoe. It might be $50, $60. Now, I think generally the stove, which you really need, isn't going to be included in that. That might be $25 more, but it's not prohibitively expensive. And that's how I got started, just borrowing, actually renting some gear from somebody. So it's a great way to try it out, right? And then snowshoes, cross-country skis, a polk sled, if that's what you want to try. All of those things, winter camping, the sleeping bags, you can rent those up there. The polk sleds I know Paragus has, and also other places rent winter sleeping bags if you wanted and you didn't want to buy it. So what I'm going to do for just a little bit before we go on to Rob, I kind of want to show you these. I have the 2 tents in bags just to show you the relative size and what you're talking about in mass. So I'm going to stop my screen share, and we're going to go back to this in a second and go into Rob. So stopping that screen share, hopefully you can zoom onto me. But the pyramid tent I had, this is it, right? This is the pole and everything, right? So you can see this is not a big tent. It's very lightweight, right? This is the Red Cliff made by Seek Outside, but it's not a heavy tent. This is lighter than, it's probably about 5 pounds. It's lighter than most tents that you would have in the summer. And then the stove that I was showing you, this is the stove. This is a titanium stove, fits in this little pack. And this is actually like I think their second largest. I usually oversize the stove when buying these things, because you don't really regret the tiny bit of extra weight on a larger stove, but you like the heating potential. So this is the chimney, and it's a long tube that you unroll and then roll up the other direction. So I would unroll this thing, and it's about 9 feet long, and it's titanium. It's very lightweight, works phenomenal. And then the stove itself is just a bunch of panels that you just sort of clip together, or clip and screw together. It maybe takes a few minutes to put this together, and it works great. Again, this is like 5 pounds maybe. It's not a heavy tent, and you could use this, in the shoulder season as well. Now, the disadvantage of this stove, rather, is it's not quite as airtight, so it's hard to really tighten it down in terms of keeping the fuel lasting longer. So that thing's not going to burn more than an hour and a half or so if you don't restock it, okay, with fuel wood. So that thing's not going to burn all night. Now, the other tent I was pointing out, it's actually my second canvas tent made by Empire Canvas, is this thing here, okay? And so, you can see this is maybe like 20 pounds. Again, it's pretty light. It's actually, this is going to get heavier on a trip sometimes because it might pick up a little moisture, but this is not bad. And this is big. This is about 9 by 12 feet set up. The poles, again, are not that big either. So we're not talking massive. This is it, right? That's your shelter along with ground cloth. And then this is the stove I use. This is by Four Dog Stove Company, which is a Minnesota company. They're phenomenal. This was made out of, I think, this is like 20 years old. And these things, the titanium ones last forever. They don't burn out. The steel ones will. And this is dynamite. But I think it's actually, the guy who made this said it was Russian surplus titanium he got at the time. But they still make it out of titanium. Lightweight. It's got the stovepipes fit inside there. And then this thing will get red hot and kick out the heat for a couple hours at least when it's tightened down. So that's the gear. just showing those things, you know, all of that stuff I just point out, you can rent, other than they usually rent an iron stove, a steel stove, because they're less expensive. But you can rent that stuff. You can give it a go. So I'm gonna go back to sharing here, and we're gonna hear some more from Rob. Let's see here. There's there you go, Rob. We're going to have time for questions at the end as well. So I'll stick around as long as people have questions.
Jump in here. Rob's hitting, mashing his F5 button to get his video up and rolling here in a second. Dan, thank you again. Questions for folks, feel free to pop them in. We're going to have quite a bit of time here at the end to jump in. Dan, we'll see you in a few. With us, Rob, of course, who is many things, attorney, avid Boundary Waters enthusiast, but most importantly, fisherman. And not just for himself. You may see Rob pop up on our blog every now and then, the Friends of the Boundary Waters, offering fishing tips, offering fishing advice. If you went to our REI Boundary Waters Day that we do in Bloomington each year, there's always the fishing table. And you have your route planning, and then you have your fishing table, and you bring your same map over, and Rob will give you notes on where to go. Here's your route, and don't forget this place. Don't forget this place. Happy to do it. We love having Rob on board whenever he has time to help us out with things. Rob, you want to talk about ice fishing, tips and tricks. Take it away.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. This just off the bat, what a great opportunity to talk for a great organization about something that involves two of my passions, the Boundary Waters and ice fishing, or fishing in general. So I'm going to focus more on, you're up there, you've listened to Dan, you know how to get enough shelter there, you're hanging out with the other trip mates that you have, but sometimes you just need an activity maybe to walk away from everybody. You've been hanging out with them all night long. You know, it's maybe time to go out there and have a little me time while you're out there. Some of those activities are, you know, the sports Dan talked about. You have snowshoeing and skiing. For me, it's ice fishing. And I found a quote that for me really was pretty apropos here. Dave Barry, a guy down in Florida, maybe a little more cold adverse than us, but the problem with winter sports is that, follow me closely here, they generally take place in winter. So that's just it, right? That hits the nail on the head. It's going to be cold. It's going to have different conditions than summer fishing. But at the end of it, it's still a very enjoyable activity, one that I find extremely rewarding. So I kind of covered this if you listen to the open water session that I did earlier this year. There are some logistics that you need to cover that are statewide, like a fishing license, a trout stamp if you're fishing in designated trout water, and other fishing regulations. And then there are some that are specific to the Boundary Waters. For example, if the lake is entirely in the Boundary Waters, looks like there might be a little delay there. If the lake is entirely in the Boundary Waters, then you have different regulations than if it's partially out of the Boundary Waters. Yeah, Dan, if you can go back one slide, I think somehow I'm not able to do it. Thank you. And you know, you can extend your season. If it's entirely in the Boundary Waters, you can start lake trout fishing on January 1. If it's partially, like Seagull Lake in the Boundary Waters, then you have to wait until January 18th if you're going for lake trout. The great thing about going for lake trout, and let's be honest here, if we're talking fishing in the Boundary Waters, we're talking lake trout. Yes, there are walleye, but the lake trout lakes in the Boundary Waters are some of the most pristine in the country, certainly in the state. The lake trout season's a whole month longer than the walleye season. So you've got all of March that you get to go for lake trout. There are certain equipment, you know, that covers the gamut as well for ice fishing, right? You're gonna have rods, you're gonna have reels, you're gonna have, you know, augers and all of that. Now, different augers, which we'll talk about. So there's some equipment that's the same, but I'm gonna cover some that's a little more specific to the Boundary Waters. Some of those, for instance, Dan talked about sleds and bulk. The great news is your lures are small when you're fishing. So when you brought, you know, 3 sleeves of lures up in the summer, you're not going to need as many in the winter. Your spoons, your jigs are much smaller. They take up less space. The bulk you will need to consider some of the creature comforts I'll talk about, the auger, and all of that. speaking of the auger, there are no machines allowed, which is why we like it there, right? How many times have you gone ice fishing on a lake close to home and you've got sleds going up and down the lake? You've got generators running all night if you've gone out to Lake of the Woods or Mille Lacs. There are no machines allowed. That's great for silence and just being one with nature. But what that means, you can't bring a gas auger and you can't bring an electric auger. You can't bring an auger that's powered by a drill. It is going to be you. If you bring a spud bar, that's fine. I would highly not recommend that. It's going to be a hand auger, and we'll talk about some recommendations for a hand auger and how to hopefully minimize the effort that you're going to have to put out. Let's see if I can move it down one here. There we go. All right. So right off the bat, staying warm. That's the key. The difference with the other sports of snowshoeing and skiing is you're not moving, right? You are sitting there over a hole until you maybe have a tip up go up and you've got to run over to that. But you need to have layers on you that are going to keep you warm being stationary. Certainly you can get up and move around, do some jumping jacks, drill another hole somewhere. But to do that, right, it's the basics of layering, and then some really good windproof and waterproof clothing. I would say multiple sets of gloves. Keep your hands as dry as you can. We'll talk about some ways to do that, but they're going to get wet, especially when you're pulling up a shark like that and it's coming up the hole. It's hard not to just stick your hand down there and pull it out. And when you do that, you're going to get your hands wet. Have an extra set of gloves. Go dry those off in the hot tent, and make sure you're prepared. Now, the other things we need to talk about really are the species and then how we're going to find those species. One great way to find the species is through an app. Let's see here if we can get this to go. We'll talk about gear first. I skipped over that. Apologies. And why would I skip over gear? That's one of the big enjoyments of fishing, right? It's they talk about lures aren't meant to catch fish. They're meant to catch fishermen people, men and women who are fishing. And with that, there's a lot of other gear. We talked about staying warm. Certainly a safety factor, but other safety factors down in the bottom middle there, those are ice picks. Certainly a very good thing to have an early ice. But when going in the boundary waters, I always bring a pair just because of the remote nature of everything. And it's something very good to help you crawl out should something happen with the ice conditions or slush or something on that front. Other safety gear, of course, could be a GPS, which also comes in handy when you're locating fish, which we'll talk about. And then there's things we've taken care of our safety and our warmth. Now we need creature comforts. One of those is a pop-up, and those are Hubs or the Clams and the Eskimos. Tons of brands of them out there. Those are great. That will help protect you from the wind. You could even bring a little buddy heater to keep yourself warm. You could set up a whole little ice fishing hole. Since you're allowed 2 lines in the water, you could set up 2 jigging rods in there. We'll talk about what that is. And stay completely within the confines of that pop-up, staying a little warmer and a little more comfortable. However, with those, you deal with more bulk, and you're also going to deal with some more weight. So just keep that in mind. I personally don't bring one. I have fished in them out there. I tend to prefer the sitting on a 5-gallon bucket. That's my creature comfort. If I have a swivel seat on a 5-gallon bucket, I can keep my electronics in there. I can keep some lures in there. I can keep even some of my bait in there. And it's all in one simple package. And the pop-ups, the 5-gallon bucket is easy to pour it around. That's my creature comfort. Another one that some people tend to overlook is bring a closed self-foam thermarest, kind of the old school thermarests, and to put that between the snow or the ice and your feet. That'll keep those feet warm. I don't know about you, but for me, once I start losing the feet, when they start going cold, I start getting cold. It's not my hands, it's not my ears or my face, it's really my feet. So having that extra layer of warmth or insulation from between you and the ice can really help. Now, the auger. So it is going to have to be a hand auger, and there are 2 really good ones out there. The one I'm showing there is a Nils. I would say that's probably considered the best or top of the line. It's a little longer, a little heavier, but it cuts great. And the other is a Strike Master. There are other brands out there, but those really are the 2 most common. And the size is not going to be what you're used to. You know, you can go out there and use a gas auger and drill a 10-inch hole and run around and pop holes everywhere. You're not going to want a hand auger that size, right? It's the area, pi r squared. When you go from 4-inch auger to a 6-inch auger, it's more than double at that point. It is going to be much more difficult. So I prefer somewhere between a 4 and a 6-inch auger, simply because I'm not great at drilling holes by hand. I've gone up there enough, and we actually call it the cold getting to us or something, but we've actually had competitions to see who can drill the fastest, and I'm at the bottom of that list every time. So I'll take a 4-inch auger, make it easier on myself. I'm not looking, and most of the lakes in the Boundary Waters, you're not going to be pulling up very large lake trout. Certainly the northerns can get large, and that 4-inch hole is going to be an issue. If you're going for some giants and that's what you're fishing, big baits for big fish, then go to that 6-inch. But beyond that, I would stick with the 4 to 6. With that, I said keep your hands dry. And to do that, bring one of these guys, a simple scoop. This one's made out of metal. It helps to break up the hole in the morning because it will start to freeze over on you. Bring a scoop for the hole. Bring a scoop for your bait bucket. That's another thing you really need to bring. This is an insulated bait bucket. This is made, again, by Strike Master, which also makes augers, because you're going to fish with live bait, most likely. And when you do that, you need to keep the minnows alive, and insulated bait bucket's really going to help you. The electronics. Going and focusing on lake trout, I almost consider this an essential piece of equipment. Lake trout, you're fishing potentially 50 feet, maybe deeper of water. And sure, you could start fishing a couple feet off the bottom, but I can tell you it happens every trip multiple times that I'm jigging down in the bottom, or I set a tip up down in the bottom and I go and check a hole. And the flasher, the sonar, the Vexlar, the Hummingbird, the Markham, whichever one name you want to call them, they are showing some fish that are actually suspended in the water column at 20, 15 feet maybe. Reel up, and there you get a hit up there. And there is no way you would have known it unless you have electronics. So having that kind of visualization of what's happening below you will make you more successful. They can be a little expensive. There are some different ones out there that are not as expensive. Some actually can plug into your phone, and you can have a little floating sonar that goes down. Your phone can get a little cold out there. These electronics here that I'm showing, that Vexlar, is meant to handle the cold. And a cell phone in the cold, you're going to lose battery life pretty quickly. But it is an option that's much lighter weight and a little more approachable. Now to kind of the basic thing, the fishing rod and reel. I would recommend something in the 26 to 28 inch range, medium light to medium, for almost an all-purpose rod. That'll get you your walleye, your panfish, your lake trout, and your northern. And if it's certainly one of your first rods, go for something all-purpose. You can get away a little bit better with an ice fishing rod that's all-purpose than you can with an open water rod that's all-purpose. The 26-inch to 28-inch range is great if you're fishing in a pop-up. It's not so long that you're going to have to sit at one far corner of the pop-up and fish a hole in the other. And it's not so short that you're going to be standing huddled over your hole and give yourself a backache by the end of the day. So I'd go with that. There are, just like open water, there are multiple styles of reels for ice fishing. There's end-line reels, there's actually bait casting reels, and then there's those regular spinning reels that you would see. They make them specific for ice. From my experience, what I stick with is an ultralight, the smallest size they make, like a Fluger Presidential, that is ultralight open water. I feel like those are just made to higher quality. I don't have issues with them freezing up in the winter. Certainly look at the grease within it before you go out. And maybe bring just a tiny little vial of it. You don't want that reel failing on when you're out there. And I have more confidence in an ultralight open water spinning reel. We will hit lures, and I'll show you some photos of some a little later on in the slide presentation. Now, you've got the gear. You need to figure out what lake you're going for. If you're targeting these lake trout, the best site to go to is actually the Lake Finder website that the Minnesota DNR puts on. I talked about this in the summer. I absolutely leverage this before any trip. I certainly have done trips where I make the trip first, I figure out the route, and I've had trips where I know the species of fish. I want to go for lake trout, walleye, northern smallmouth, try to get a grand slam. I want to go to some more of the secluded brook trout lakes. If I'm targeting that species, I need to know what lake to go to. So this is where I go and look. It will give you an idea of the size and numbers. It'll give you a summary of the lake, let you know when that survey was taken. It actually pretty informative. Some of the surveys can be a little old, so figure that that part out, how much you want to trust that. But the numbers definitely are helpful. Dan mentioned earlier about blue snow. We were targeting lake trout. If we went to blue snow with the idea of going for walleye, we would have had, I mean, we'd had a good time, but we would have just set ourselves up for failure because there aren't walleye in blue snow, but there are reported lake trout. So focus, if you're focusing on a species, make sure you're going to the right lake for that. When you get to the lake, where do you fish? So there are some differences between locating them in summer and winter. The fish can tend to be lower or deeper in the winter, but the big difference is that you can't cover water you can't cover water as well in a motorboat as a canoe or vice versa. And you certainly can't when you don't have a snowmobile and you're snowshoeing or skiing across a lake. Not to mention when you get to your spot, you have to hand drill. So you need to really develop a plan. I mentioned I'm not great at drilling holes, so I like to develop a grid pattern. I like to vary the depth, and the red circles here that are kind of in a triangle, that kind of indicates a grid that I'm looking at. I'm covering everything from, say, 12 feet all the way down to that 25-foot-ish range. And I'm covering at different depths, at different contour lines there. Whereas these green dots here are all in a line, right? They're parallel. You're just basically fishing the same contoured line, the same depth. And if the fish are deeper or shallow, you're not going to find them. So develop a grid pattern, figure out roughly where you want to go. Look for the sharp contrasting lines. The closer these lines are together, the steeper or the more drastic the change. Lake trout, for example, like to run the bait fish up into a very sharp decline so that they can run the bait up and catch up to them faster. That's a great spot to look. Deep holes are a great spot to look as well. The one thing I talked about running water all the time in the summer presentation, I hope it goes without saying, avoid running water in the winter. The fish are really not going to be stacked up there, and you are only setting yourself up for a very dangerous situation. One of the other things you can do is let maybe the wind and the weather dictate where you go. Look for a side that is not getting wind blown. Look for a bit of a wind block for a point or behind some trees, and then see if there's contour lines over there. If you are too cold when you're out there and you have to reel in all your lines, you're definitely not catching fish. The longer you have your line in the water, the better your chances. So maybe the wind will help you decide. At the end of the day, it's the boundary water still. Be flexible. If you have something down there worth biting, the fish will bite it. You just have to be out there long enough and in a generally right location for them to find you. All right. The great thing about ice fishing is there's really two techniques: jigging and dead sticking, also tip-ups. Both have very different actions that are going to be presented. They both have pros and cons, and we'll go through those now in a pretty much a really truncated presentation on it. I could do a whole presentation just on lures. When you become really kind of addicted to fishing, you get to be a little bit of a gearhead. So I'll try to cover them as general as I can, but certainly you'll see at the end. If you have some questions, feel free to ask. Okay, jigging. Jigging is just kind of like what you do in the summer, right? It is basically imparting action on a lure straight down below you, trying to get the attention of fish swimming by. It's a very simple approach. The lures vary quite a lot, and it can catch almost every variety. You can use live bait as well as artificial. So if you are not one who wants to deal with the hassle of hauling in live bait in the middle of winter, you can use plastics. Certainly, like these are, see if I can get that in there for you. These are white tubes, which are great for jigging with a jig head, which is in the bottom right, for lake trout, or a little smaller plastic for walleye or panfish. If you want to use live bait, you can put on a complete live minnow, or you can actually use partial minnows to preserve your bait a little bit longer. Tons of different types of presentation in terms of the actual lure itself. You have jigs, which are basically just a weight with a hook. And most of them are made out of lead. That's historically what they've been made out of. But there are a lot of lead alternatives now. There is tin and steel. The most popular is tungsten. There's bismuth. There's actually ceramic and clay ones. And they all actually offer quite an advantage over lead in that specifically tungsten is denser. So you can have a smaller profile and still get it down and down in the water column quicker if you go with the tungsten. So if you're just curious about doing lead alternatives, winter's a really great time to figure out and to feel the difference about using tungsten versus lead. Other options, and personally my favorite way to do it, is to use a spoon. There are a lot of different spoons out there. This one right in the middle on that top photo is my personal favorite. That's a VMC flutter spoon type style. And then you've got buckshots, you've got tingle spoons, you've got, there's perch knockers, which I see in there as well. And those spoons really they kind of create a flash when they're falling down the water column. And you just jig up and down, and you vary the cadence, you vary how far you jig, you vary the depth, lots of different ways there. Cranks, I put in kind of quotes there because there's a lot of different kinds. You can use a lipless crank. I've seen people very successful with that. You can use a wrapless snap jig. You can use, this is a blade bait, the silver one in the middle. There's different cranks, and those are going to go for some of your bigger species. Two big things to think about color-wise in winter. One is glow, UV glow and regular glow that are just powered up with a headlamp. Very popular, certainly can work at night. And then the other is noise. You can have beads in there, like the buckshot, for example, has two little basically things of buckshot on the back side of it. And when you jig it up and down, it creates noise. Those are certainly very effective. Just throwing it out there, if you're going for lake trout, use a spoon that's silver with maybe a little blue or something that's white. Those are really the predominant colors. Certainly you can catch them on others, but I really focus on that. With jigging, of course, the fish are going to probably hit it on the move, or if they're hitting it as it's falling, you need to have high sensitivity. So I prefer to use a braid line that's no stretch. That way you can feel every single bite, hopefully, that happens there, because sometimes they can light bite, especially when it's falling down. The other option is tip-up fishing or dead stick fishing. Since you're allowed two lines in the water at the same time, instead of sitting there and jigging two holes right next to each other, you can actively jig one hole and place a tip up a couple yards, 10 yards away from you. That is basically it. You can set it at the right depth. You put it on a spool. It drops down to where you want the bait to be presented. And when a fish takes the bait, it spins the spool and raises the flag. It's a great indicator to let you know you've had a bite. This does not work well with artificial. This is much more of a live bait presentation, or like a salted minnow type presentation. You're not imparting action here, so you either need the bait to do that, or you need to have some kind of scent factor to it. With the tip up, there are a couple things to note specifically on the regulation front. There are things called quick strike rigs, which are very good for fish health, as well as for improving your hookup percentage. There is a distance, 9 inches, that can be done between the hooks. Check the Minnesota regulations for that. I have seen some of the bigger box stores selling what I would consider exceeding that 9-inch separation, because they just sell it around the country and they're not specific to Minnesota. So do take care of that if you don't make your own and you buy them. The tip up or dead stick gives you another advantage. You can be closer to your tent, warming up or sitting outside by a fire, and set up a tip up with a light. So you can actually night fish. And when it goes up, then that light turns on and you can actually have an indicator that it's got a fish on there. You can run out there. It's actually quite exhilarating when you see that light flashing out there in the middle of the winter. It's certainly a good sight. One thing to really consider, though, is that if you leave a tip up out there cooler, and then when it gets cooler, those things will freeze up pretty good. So think about getting an ice hole insulation cover, or This is like a beaver dam style tip up I'm showing you, which is very classic. There's also this kind, which as you can see, has an insulated circle underneath. It's just styrofoam, the spool here, and then the flag up top. That'll help keep everything insulated and hopefully prevent ice up as well. Another thing, if you notice, that flag was black in color. I actually prefer the flag to be darker. Most you'll see out there is bright orange. I don't know if it's my eyes or what, but I tend to see the black flags a lot easier in the daylight than I do the orange. Just a personal preference, certainly something you should experiment with yourself. That is about as fast as it can go for as many details as I wanted to talk about. I hopefully covered most of your questions, and I hope that if you go out and you're an avid fisherman, you maybe learn something new, and if not, then I hope maybe if this is something you're thinking about getting into, I hopefully maybe give you a little more excitement about something to try this winter up in the Boundary Waters. Thanks, everyone.
So thank you, Rob. So we have a couple things to cover here. Questions are coming in. I can see them slowly popping up. First things first, I want to say thank you to everybody that stopped by. We have a giveaway to do for Mr. Dan Pauly, who wrote a book. Dan, can you tell us about what someone's going to win here in a few?
So I'm donating, it'll be a signed copy of a guidebook really for summer camping to the Boundary Waters, Explore the Boundary Waters. It is published by the University of Minnesota Press, and so happy to donate it for the friends.
Okay, so we looked through the whole list of people. You know, we checked through the participants, and we have someone picked. Dan, do you have his name still?
I don't actually.
Okay, so pop it in the chat real quick here. Ramses, and you want a signed book, so please get a hold of us. We'll ship it out to you, no problem. So questions, please keep them coming in. Want to mention real quick, thank you again for all the support. Why we're able to do this free of cost is really because of you. How we send kids up there, because of you. This doesn't happen randomly. It takes your support to really make that happen. So if you're willing to just chip in, join a membership, you can read up in both of our blogs and newsletters when Rob and Dan write little stories for us, which are always interesting, just by becoming a member. We send them straight to you, straight to your inbox. So with that, a couple questions right away. Dan, missed the name of the tent rental company off of Highway 61. Can you remind us who that is?
I believe Sawtooth Outfitters carries them.
Okay, Sawtooth, gotcha. Okay, quick here for Rob. Where do you pick up bait, non-live stuff?
Non-live. So around the Twin Cities, that's where I'm at. So quite frankly, that's where my preference is going to be. I'm a big fan of Thorn Brothers up in Blaine. Great little shop. They make their own custom rods as well. Great company, really nice selection. You could also go to Cabela's. Cabela's in Minnesota carries some decent ice gear as well. And there's certainly online venues. Live bait, I prefer to go to Ely and Grand Marais, and there's numerous places up there for that.
Wonderful to hear. Right here, brand of the titanium stove Dan mentioned. It's a Minnesota company.
Yep. So the Minnesota one is 4Dog Stove Company.
4 Dogs.
4Dog. That's named apparently. The more dogs you have back in the day, the warmer you would be, because you would have them in your tent. So
that does make
4
sense.
Dog.
That does make sense. Speaking of keeping warm, Dan, how do you keep your hands warm in the winter? How do you keep them warm?
So what I use, because you're doing a lot of things, you're taking your gloves off and on or whatever. Mittens are generally going to be better than a glove. So I use a shell design. Outdoor Research makes mine, but shell design that has like a fleece insert, because then you can have 2 or 3 fleece inserts. You take those out, dry them if you need to, but you want something that ideally comes apart so it can be dried.
Right. All right, a quick one here for Rob. Is there a good tackle company that sells all non-lead gear online?
So in terms of all non-lead gear, in terms of jigs, yes, there are a lot of companies out there that you can find. And they all are really good. There's a lot of good custom ones out there. Like I mentioned, Thorn Brothers, they do actually a lot of, let's call them garage type companies that are just making them themselves. that are really good quality jig heads. Northland Tackle's involved with that and other things. I know like with the bismuth, which is not a very popular one, Water Gremlin, that was the material they decided to focus on, and that's a Minnesota company. The reason I said all non-lead free, and I gave a little pause there, your crankbaits like Rapala and all of that, they are still using leads for weight in those. So if you're looking to go completely lead free, the crankbait option may be something you want to avoid until the manufacturers catch up to where the market's actually going.
Right, and obviously people want them. Like that's abundantly clear. They're gonna come. Dan, question here: cots. Would you recommend them for winter camping?
Yeah, I do. I actually have a Helinox cot that I sometimes will take up, and they're great. Very lightweight. You could use other cots too, but you often will still want a sleeping pad on that thing because it's just not going to be. It's going to lift you off the ground, but not keep you warm. And that air underneath with your sleeping bag compressed is an issue. So actually, I often will use a cot.
Gotcha. On that, what was that liner you talked about for winter camping?
Liner, was that with regard to the Seek Outside tent, perhaps?
I believe so, yeah.
So Seek Outside, that was the pyramid tent. You can line that with a little, they sell like a little shell, I guess an interior shell, that creates like a little air pockets so that you don't get as much condensation on the inside.
Okay. Obvious question I have to ask. Rob, where are the favorite lakes for fish? Give us the dirt. Where's the good stuff?
Always expect the question, right? Always expect it. I do tend to keep lakes a little close to the chest, but there are some ones that are out there that are popular. And if we're talking winter fishing, like I'm not hiding any secrets here. It's all about lake trout for me. So there really are two kind of main areas for me. Dan actually mentioned one of them there, Seagull to Paulson. That area is very, very good. Seagull, especially if it's kind of a beginner trip for you. It's basically all a lake in. There's no portaging with that unless you go up to Paulson, and then you really got yourself a portage. Otherwise, I'm a big fan of going into Tuscarora and fishing over there with bat and gillis, going in a little deeper, but you're gonna have portaging there, especially at Portage into Tuscarora. That's a mile-long plus portage that you definitely want snowshoes. I wouldn't bring skis on that one, but that's where I would focus if you're looking on lake trail.
All right. Dan, question here on tools. What set of tools do you usually bring with you, especially for like assembling your stove?
Sure. So, by the way, I'd add with fishing, most of those lake trout lakes are going to be off the Gunflint, but Clearwater is another one. The Clearwater area is a nice place to go winter ice fishing too. But in terms of tools, the most tools you're really always bringing are like saws and axes, right? Stuff like that's essential, and you're gonna want a saw for every person almost, right? Because you cut a lot of wood. And I'd never bring a hatchet or an axe generally in the summer. I just don't. But you're gonna want some way to split wood in the winter too. But then this, like my one stove, it has the little like hand threaded
the wing nut things.
Wing nuts. That's right, Mike. But I always have a Leatherman along, right? But otherwise, there's not any real special tools that you would need. Even with that collapsible stove.
Yeah, I would voice a pair of pliers like a Leatherman or something like that. It's also good for fishing. When you get into a toothy critter, it's good to have something to maybe not even take that glove off and be able to reach in and dehook.
Right. Instead of just a Swiss Army knife, having a Leatherman actually really does matter there.
Yeah.
Okay, so last question we got here. Dan, anchoring a tent. How do you do that in the winter?
Yep. Like the A-frame type tent that Snow Tracker makes, the tent is going to stand up on its own, but you're still going to guy it out. And so you can guy it out and tie it, for example, to trees, or what works surprisingly well, actually, is what people refer to as a dead man, where you take a branch, tie your rope onto it, and then stick it in the snow, maybe cover it up with some snow, and that in like an hour turns hard, and actually sometimes they're hard to get out, so you don't have to put hot water or anything. That will stay. And so the seek outside tent, you'd want to do that as well, because that won't stand up on its own. And in that case, you want to have the kinds of ropes that have a little slider on it. So you put it in the snow. You can't necessarily tighten it too tight right away because it would pull out. But then an hour or two later, when that snow has, coalesced, then you can tighten that thing down and you'll have a tent that's going to stand up in pretty hard winds.
One other tool I was just thinking about, going back to the question, a shovel is really good for your tent setup as well as for when you're drilling holes, because it will get very slushy. So you really do need maybe more than one shovel, and the bigger the shovel, those plastic snow shovels work really well.
Right. Well, that's what we have for questions. Any last words, Dan or Rob?
My closing thoughts would be, give it a try. Honestly, it's a great, incredible time to go to the Boundary Waters. Winter is like a long season in Minnesota, and it's phenomenal in the Boundary Waters.
Gotcha.
Absolutely. Get out there and enjoy the winter. Winter camping is an absolute. I was very cautious my first time going up there, I'll be honest, as a South Carolina transplant. Just getting out there in below zero weather seemed crazy. But yeah, there's a lot of activities to do out there. It's a long season. Get out there and enjoy the nature we have.
Absolutely right. That's best time to go. No bugs, beautiful skies.
Absolutely.
How can you say no to those things? So thank you, everybody. This is the end of our annual gathering. We really appreciate everybody who came. Dan, Rob, we'll see you again soon. And for everybody else, we'll be back. Take care.